The air over the village was dry and heavy, the kind that made your lips crack and your spirit splinter. It hadn't rained in months, and what little remained of the harvest lay shriveled under a sky that refused mercy. Lydia sat on the dirt floor of her family's hut, her fingers tracing the worn edges of her dress. It was the only one she owned. The same faded blue she had worn for years, now too tight around her arms and waist. Outside, her mother was arguing with someone, her voice trembling with desperation. Lydia didn't know yet that her life was about to be bargained away. Their only cow had died 3 weeks ago, a thin creature that had once given milk enough to trade for flour and salt. Without it, there was no way to survive the coming season. Her mother, Mara, was a woman hardened by loss. Her husband had long since vanished in search of work, leaving her to care for a daughter she saw as a burden. Slow, soft-spoken, and large-bodied in a world that worshipped thinness and labor. The villagers had always whispered cruelly, calling Lydia the girl who ate her father's fortune. Mara had begun to believe them. That morning, a tall man rode into the village on a wagon filled with cattle feed and tools. He was Caleb Holt, a rancher known for his size and silence, a man the townsfolk respected but rarely approached. His shadow seemed to stretch as far as his land, they said, and his voice, when used, was like thunder over plains. He had come to buy grain, but when Mara saw the brand on his wagon and the strong beasts tied behind, an idea formed, a terrible, shameful idea that felt in her mind like salvation. "Mr. Holt," Mara began, wringing her hands, "I hear you need help on your ranch. I have a daughter, strong enough to work, good with chores." Caleb looked past her, his eyes finding Lydia standing in the doorway, her shoulders hunched as though trying to disappear. He didn't answer. "She's a burden to me," Mara continued, her voice cracking. "But she could be useful to someone like you. You have cattle." She swallowed hard. "I'll trade her for a cow." Silence fell over the yard. Even the flies seemed to pause. Lydia froze, unsure she had heard correctly. Her mother's words didn't make sense at first, then they did, and they burned. Her chest tightened, her throat refused breath. She looked at Caleb, half expecting him to laugh, to spit, to turn away in disgust. But he didn't. His jaw clenched, and his blue-gray eyes softened with something she didn't recognize, something like pity, but deeper. Finally, he said in a low, measured voice, "I don't trade people." Mara flinched. "Then what will you give me for her?" Caleb's hand went to his hat brim. He looked at Lydia again, at her fear, her shame, her trembling hands. "Keep your cow," he said. "I'll take the girl, but not as property." Lydia blinked, confused. Mara looked equally stunned. Before either could speak, Caleb turned, his tone final. "Pack what she owns. We leave before sundown." That evening, as the orange light fell over the barren land, Lydia climbed onto his wagon. Her mother didn't hug her. She only watched as the dust rose behind them, her face empty. Lydia didn't cry until the village disappeared from sight. Caleb said nothing. His silence, though vast, felt different from her mother's. It wasn't cruel. It was waiting, like the earth before rain. The wagon creaked as it rolled down the long, dusty trail, cutting through hills that looked like sleeping beasts under the amber sunset. Lydia sat stiffly on the wooden seat beside Caleb Holt, her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never left her village before. The air here smelled of dry sage and horse sweat, thick with a silence she didn't know how to breathe in. Caleb held the reins loosely, his massive hands steady, his face turned toward the horizon. He didn't glance at her, not even once in the first hour. Lydia tried to make herself small, though she was anything but. Her mother's words still echoed in her ears. "I'll trade her for a cow." Each repetition of that sentence felt like another stone in her chest. She wanted to ask him why he'd agreed to take her, what he expected of her. But fear clamped her voice shut. The road wound through patches of brittle grass and dry riverbeds. They passed the outskirts of the village where people stared openly. Men paused their work, women whispered, and children pointed. Lydia heard one of them shout, "There goes the cowgirl!" followed by cruel laughter. She turned her face away, cheeks burning hot with shame. Caleb's hand tightened on the reins, the only sign that he'd heard. He didn't stop, didn't speak. The horses kept their rhythm, steady, unbothered, mercifully indifferent. After some time, the sky darkened to a bruised violet. A cool wind picked up, carrying the scent of distant rain. Lydia shivered. Caleb noticed. Without a word, he reached behind the seat and pulled out a thick wool coat, his coat, worn and far too big for her. He handed it over silently. Lydia hesitated, glancing at him as if afraid it was a test. He simply said, in a voice rough but not unkind, "It's cold." She slipped it on. The coat smelled faintly of leather and smoke, and warmth spread through her arms, though not just from the wool. For the first time, someone had offered her something without mockery, without cost. She looked out at the road again, unsure what to do with the feeling rising in her chest. Hours passed before Caleb finally spoke again. "What's your name?" "Lydia," she stammered. He nodded. "I figured. Your ma said it once." His tone was flat but not unfeeling. "You'll be safe on my ranch, Lydia. You'll have a room. Work if you want to. Eat as much as you need." She blinked at him, startled. I don't understand." "You don't want anything?" Caleb glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable in the half-light. "No, you've been wanted for things all your life, haven't you? Not for yourself." The words struck deep. Lydia couldn't answer. Tears stung her eyes, but she turned her face toward the darkening horizon so he wouldn't see. They rode through the night, the rhythm of the wheels like a slow heartbeat. Lydia watched the stars appear one by one, wondering how something so endless could exist in a world that had been so small and cruel to her. Caleb occasionally hummed under his breath, a low tune, mournful and strangely comforting. When the wagon finally stopped near a lonely stretch of pasture, the moon was high. A small cabin glowed in the distance. "That's Holt Ranch," he said. "You can rest there tonight." Lydia nodded, but her thoughts were tangled. She didn't know if this man was her captor, her savior, or something in between. Yet for the first time in her life, as she looked at the quiet land and the tall man guiding the horses, she felt something close to possibility, like standing at the edge of a new beginning she didn't yet trust to believe in. When the wagon crested the last hill, the land unfolded like a quiet secret. Below them stretched Holt Ranch, hundreds of acres of pale gold pasture bordered by a slow river and distant blue-gray mountains. The world here seemed enormous, yet hollow, filled with the kind of silence that made every heartbeat sound louder. Lydia had never seen so much space in her life. It both terrified and awed her. Caleb drove the horses down the slope, stopping before a weather-beaten house with a porch that sagged slightly under its own age. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and two dogs ran out barking, tails wagging when they saw their master. Lydia tensed, clutching the edge of the wagon, but the dogs only sniffed her and trotted away. Caleb climbed down, his boots crunching the gravel, and offered her a hand. She hesitated. No one had offered her a hand since she was a child, but finally took it. His palm was calloused and warm. "This way," he said simply, lifting her small bundle of clothes and walking toward the house. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and bread. A lantern burned low on the table. The space was sparse, a sturdy bed, shelves of books and tools, a big stone hearth. Yet everything was clean and well kept. Lydia followed him through a short hallway to a tiny room. The bed there was neatly made, the quilt faded but soft. "You can stay here," Caleb said. "There's a basin by the window and clean towels. Supper's in an hour." He turned to leave, but she stopped him timidly. Why are you doing this?" He paused in the doorway, the lamplight catching the rough lines of his face. "Because someone should have done it for me once," he murmured. Then he walked away, boots echoing down the hall. Lydia stood alone in the small room, clutching her bundle. Her throat felt thick. She set her things down and sat on the bed. The quilt creaked beneath her weight, the mattress firm but gentle. For the first time in years, she wasn't sleeping on dirt. Still, her chest hurt. She kept hearing her mother's voice, the flat, cold tone when she'd said, "I'll trade her for a cow." Shame still lived under her skin like a bruise that wouldn't fade. When she stepped outside later, the sun had vanished behind the hills. The ranch was still, the cattle grazing like moving shadows. Caleb stood by the fence, checking the posts. She watched him for a while, the enormous man working quietly, without hurry or anger. His movements were steady, purposeful, like the rhythm of the land itself. Something about it soothed her. Supper was simple: beans, bread, and tea. They ate mostly in silence. Lydia didn't know what to say, afraid of sounding foolish. Caleb asked once if she could read, and when she said no, he only nodded and said, "We'll fix that." That single promise hung in her mind long after the dishes were washed. Later, in her room, Lydia lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The sounds of the ranch drifted through the thin walls, the lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill, the soft crackle of firewood. Each sound was unfamiliar, yet not unkind. The stillness wasn't the cruel quiet of neglect she'd known at home. It was the deep silence of a place that expected nothing from her. That simply was. She turned on her side, wrapping the quilt around her. For the first time since she could remember, no one called her names. No one told her she was a burden. She breathed in the faint smell of soap and pine from the blanket and whispered to herself, "Maybe this is what safe feels like." Outside, Caleb sat on the porch, watching the moon rise over his land. He glanced once toward the small window where a faint light still burned, and for a fleeting moment, the hard lines of his face softened. Neither of them knew it yet, but that lonely ranch had just become the place where two lost souls would begin to heal. The first weeks on Holt Ranch were both a test and a rebirth for Lydia. The work began before sunrise. Caleb would tap on her door at dawn, not harshly, but firmly, and say, "Time to earn your breakfast." She would rise, dress quickly, and follow him into the chill of morning. The sky over the plains glowed pink and gold, the air still wet with dew. Everything smelled of soil and hay, clean and alive. At first, Lydia was clumsy. Her hands, soft from years of small chores at home, blistered against rope and shovel. She spilled feed, tripped over tools, and once got her skirt tangled in a gate. The ranch hands snickered behind her back, their laughter sharp as thorns. Some called her cowgirl in a mocking tone, a cruel reminder of how she'd come here. She bore it in silence, pretending their words didn't cut her. But at night, when she washed the dirt from her hands, her tears fell into the basin. Caleb never joined in their laughter. He didn't scold the men either. He just worked beside her, quietly correcting her grip on the shovel or showing her how to tie a proper knot. When she fumbled, he said, "Again," not unkindly until she got it right. His patience confused her. No man had ever treated her mistakes as something worth fixing, rather than mocking. One morning, after a long day of mending fences, Lydia overheard two ranch hands talking near the barn. "She's the one her ma traded for a cow," one sneered. "Guess the boss took pity on her," the other replied. "Or maybe he's just lonely," Lydia froze. The words twisted inside her like a knife. She wanted to scream, to tell them they were wrong, but shame stole her breath. Instead, she turned and ran to the far pasture, collapsing behind a haystack. Her chest ached, her hands shaking. She hated herself for caring. It was there that Caleb found her an hour later. He said nothing at first, only leaned against the fence, watching the sky turn orange. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even. "You heard them, didn't you?" She nodded, wiping her eyes quickly. "They're right," she whispered. "That's what I am, a trade." "A mistake." Caleb turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "No," he said flatly. "They're wrong. You weren't traded. You were saved." Lydia let out a bitter laugh. "Saved? From what?" He crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "From people who couldn't see your worth." The words stunned her. No one had ever spoken of her like that, without pity, without disgust. "Just truth. You'll get stronger," he said after a pause. "Let them talk. Work hard enough, and their words won't matter." Then, softer, "You don't have to prove anything to me." Something in her heart shifted. The ache didn't vanish, but it loosened its hold. From then on, Lydia worked differently. She carried buckets without complaint, learned to ride the gentlest horse, and even started humming as she swept the porch in the evenings. The same men who mocked her began to fall silent when she passed. Her determination wore them down more effectively than any argument. At night, Caleb sometimes left a plate of cornbread outside her door if she'd skipped supper. He never mentioned it in the morning, and neither did she. The unspoken kindness became its own language between them. Weeks melted into months. Lydia's hands grew rough, her body stronger. The sun browned her skin, and she moved through the ranch with quiet confidence. The woman who had once been traded for a cow was now earning her keep, and slowly, unknowingly, earning the respect of the man who had given her a second chance. Yet deep inside, Lydia still feared the world's cruelty. She didn't yet know that life had another trial waiting, a test of courage that would either break her or finally prove her strength to herself. The summer heat arrived like punishment. The grass dried to brittle straw, the wind turned sharp and restless, and every breath felt like it came through dust. Lydia had learned to live with the land by now, her body stronger, her spirit steadier, but even she could feel something uneasy stirring in the air. The ranch animals were skittish. The dogs barked at nothing. Caleb kept his gaze fixed on the horizon more often, watching the skies as if expecting trouble. Then one evening, trouble came. It started with thunder, distant, rolling, without rain. Lydia was milking the cows when she saw the first flash of light cut across the clouds. The sky split open with fire instead of water. A dry lightning strike had hit the far pasture, and within minutes flames were crawling across the grass, hungry and fast. Caleb's voice rang out from the porch. "Fire! South field!" Panic tore through the ranch like wind through straw. The ranch hands ran for buckets and blankets. Horses neighed, terrified, as smoke filled the air. Lydia's heart raced, but before she could think, her body moved. She dropped the milk pail and ran toward the fire. Caleb shouted after her, but his voice was drowned by the roar of the flames. The heat hit her first, like a wall, heavy and furious. The fire was spreading along the fence line, where several calves were trapped in a small pen. Lydia's eyes burned, her lungs filled with smoke, but she could hear their cries, desperate, frightened. Without hesitation, she climbed through the fence and ran to them. The wooden posts were already smoldering. She untied the ropes, slapping at sparks that leapt onto her skirt. The calves bolted through the opening she made, escaping into the open field. Behind her, the flames surged. The world became a blur of orange and black. She tried to turn, but her foot caught on a fallen board. She fell hard, scraping her arm against the ground. The smell of burning hay filled her nose. Her arm throbbed, the skin already blistering from heat. She coughed, dizzy, struggling to stand. Then, through the smoke, a shadow loomed, a giant running toward her. Caleb. He grabbed her under the arms and lifted her as if she weighed nothing. "What the hell were you thinking?" he shouted over the crackle. She couldn't answer. She clung to him as he carried her away from the fire. His shirt was damp with sweat and soot, his face streaked with ash. When they reached the water trough near the barn, he set her down and plunged her burned arm into the cool water. Lydia gasped, pain and relief colliding in her chest. Caleb knelt beside her, breathing hard. His voice, when it came, trembled, not with anger but fear. "You could have died out there," he said. "You don't run into fire, girl." She looked up at him, her face streaked with soot and tears. "I couldn't leave them," she whispered. "If I had, they'd have burned." He froze, meeting her eyes. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then softer, he said, "Then at least I'd have known you cared. But don't you ever think your life means less than theirs?" Something cracked open between them then, something raw and wordless. Caleb wrapped her arm in a wet cloth, his hand surprisingly gentle for their size. The flames still glowed on the horizon, but the danger had passed. The men were cheering faintly in the distance, their silhouettes small against the fire's dying light. Caleb stayed beside her long after. The night smelled of smoke and wet earth. Lydia's arm throbbed, but her heart felt strangely light. For the first time, she had not hidden or obeyed. She had acted. She had faced the fire and survived it. As Caleb stood and looked at her, Something in his expression softened into quiet pride. "You matter now," he said quietly. "You always did." And though she didn't say it aloud, Lydia knew she would never forget those. The fire left behind a strange stillness, like the land itself was holding its breath after a scream. For days, smoke hung in the air, and ash drifted across Holt Ranch like gray snow. The pastures were blackened, the fences charred, but the cattle were safe. Everyone said it was a miracle. Yet Lydia couldn't lift her arm without wincing, and every time she caught Caleb watching her bandaged skin, she felt something twist inside her that wasn't just pain. Caleb tended her wound himself. He didn't trust the ranch hands with gentleness. Each morning, he'd sit beside her at the kitchen table, unwrapping the old cloth and replacing it with a clean one soaked in cool water and salve. The burn had left red, angry streaks up her arm, but his touch was careful, almost reverent. Lydia, who had spent most of her life flinching from human contact, found herself sitting still beneath his hands. "You're healing well," he'd say quietly, tying the bandage. "Won't be long before you're back to work." She'd nod, eyes downcast. But inside, something else stirred, a warmth that frightened her more than the fire had. When he wasn't tending to her, Caleb worked long hours rebuilding the fences and burned fields. Lydia watched him from the porch, guilt gnawing at her. She blamed herself for rushing into danger, for making him worry, for being the cause of the wound she now carried. One evening, as the sun bled into the hills, she finally gathered her courage and spoke. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Caleb stopped hammering and looked up. "For what?" "For being careless. For making you come after me." He leaned on the fence post, studying her. "You were saving lives," he said. "That's not carelessness." "But you were angry." His gaze softened. "I was scared, Lydia. There's a difference." The word scared coming from a man like him felt almost impossible. He was built like an oak tree, silent, immovable. To imagine him afraid was like imagining the mountains tremble. But his eyes told her it was true. For a while, they stood in silence, the evening wind tugging at her hair. Then Lydia asked what she'd been wondering since the night he'd taken her from the village. "Why did you take me, Caleb? You didn't know me. You could have left me there." He turned back toward the pasture, his shoulders tense. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said quietly, "Because once someone left me the same way." Lydia frowned. "Left you?" "My father," he said simply. "When I was your age, he traded me for a team of horses. To a man who owned land up north. Said it was better for both of us." His voice was steady but heavy. "I worked there until the man died. Never saw my father again." Lydia's chest tightened. She understood now, the silence, the patience, the way he'd looked at her that first day. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. "I swore," Caleb continued, "that if I ever saw someone treated the way I'd been, I wouldn't turn my back." He finally faced her, eyes glinting in the fading light. "You remind me of what I might have been if someone had chosen kindness instead of trade." Lydia swallowed hard, her throat thick. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to say something more than the ache that sat in her chest, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stepped forward, and for a moment her uninjured hand brushed his arm. The contact was brief, but it said everything she couldn't. "I understand. I'm grateful. I see you too." When she went to bed that night, she lay awake staring at her bandaged arm. It would scar, she knew, but for once she didn't hate the mark it would leave. It was proof, not of her pain, but of what she had survived. Proof that fire hadn't taken her. It had forged her, words, for as long as she lived. By the time autumn came, the ranch had healed in the same quiet way Lydia had, slowly, invisibly, but completely. The pastures were green again, the fences rebuilt, and the cattle grazed as though the fire had never touched the earth. Lydia had become part of the rhythm of Holt Ranch. She rose before dawn, worked beside the men, and laughed without fear of being mocked. Her arms had grown strong, her back steady, and though the burn mark still traced her skin like a faint map of flame, she wore it without shame. It was her reminder of what she had survived. But peace. Lydia learned rarely lasts unchallenged. One afternoon, as she was collecting eggs from the chicken coop, she heard the sound of wheels crunching over gravel. The ranch dogs barked, their deep growls announcing a stranger's approach. When Lydia turned, her heart dropped. A rickety wagon was pulling into the yard, and on it sat a face she thought she'd never see again. Her mother. Mara looked thinner than before, her eyes sharper, her clothes ragged but cleaner than Lydia remembered. She climbed down from the wagon and brushed the dust off her skirt. Her gaze swept the ranch, lingering on the sturdy fences, the fattened cattle, the house with smoke curling from its chimney. Then her eyes found Lydia. "Well," Mara said, her voice a mixture of relief and envy. "You've done well for yourself." Lydia froze, the basket of eggs trembling in her hands. "What are you doing here?" Her mother gave a small, bitter smile. "I came to see how my daughter fared after running off with a rancher." "The village talks, you know." "I didn't run off," Lydia said quietly. "You gave me away." Mara's face twitched, but she didn't deny it. "I did what I had to." "You were—" She hesitated, searching for words that would sound less cruel. "More than I could feed." Before Lydia could answer, Caleb stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth. The moment Mara saw him, her expression shifted, calculating, wary. She dipped her head slightly. "Mr. Holt, I presume. I've heard of your kindness. I came to thank you for taking in my girl." Caleb's jaw tightened. "She's not my girl," he said evenly. "She's her own person." Mara's smile faltered. "Of course. Still, I can't imagine she works for free. Perhaps we could discuss compensation?" The word hung in the air like a snake. Lydia's breath caught. "Mother, no." Mara ignored her. "I'm not asking much, Mr. Holt. A few dollars for the trouble I took raising her. She's clearly done you good here." Caleb's expression darkened. "You don't get to sell her twice," he said. His voice wasn't raised, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "You left her to starve. I won't give you a cent. She's free to stay or go wherever she chooses, but she's not for sale." Mara's face hardened, pride burning where shame should have been. "You think you've saved her?" "She's still the same soft, useless girl she was when I sent her away." Lydia felt something inside her snap, not in pain, but in release. For years, she had carried her mother's words like chains. Now, standing tall in the sunlight, she felt them break. "You're wrong," she said quietly. "I'm not that girl anymore. You traded me for a cow, but he—" She glanced at Caleb, her voice steady. "He treated me like I was worth more than all the cattle in this valley. You don't get to call me yours again." Mara opened her mouth, but no words came. The silence between them stretched, heavy and final. Caleb stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "You should leave." Mara turned back to her wagon, her shoulders rigid. She climbed aboard, muttering something Lydia couldn't hear, and drove away. The dust rose behind her, and just like that, the ghost of her past was gone. When the road was empty again, Lydia exhaled a trembling breath. Caleb looked at her, his eyes soft with quiet pride. "You handled that better than most," he said. Lydia smiled faintly, tears pricking her eyes. "I didn't handle it," she whispered. "I ended it." And in that moment, for the first time, she truly understood what freedom felt like. The days after her mother's visit felt strangely quiet, as if the ranch itself were holding its breath. The confrontation had stirred something deep in Lydia, something that left her both lighter and lonelier. For years she had longed for her mother's approval, had worked and starved and prayed for a single kind word. But now, standing on her own, she realized that the love she'd wanted might never have existed at all. The wound her mother left was no longer open. It was a scar, and scars didn't ache forever. Caleb didn't mention what had happened. He'd watched from a distance, letting her fight her own battle, trusting her strength. But Lydia noticed small gestures, how he left a fresh loaf of bread by her door the next morning, or how he mended the broken latch on her window before dawn. He didn't speak of kindness. He simply did it. The ranch hands, once quick to gossip, now treated her differently. Their jokes had faded into respect. Some even asked her for help with small tasks, mending harnesses, tending sick calves. Lydia's name no longer carried shame. It carried weight, Still, at night, she couldn't shake the echo of her mother's parting words. She's still the same useless girl. The insult had no power anymore, but it lingered in memory like the last ember of a dead fire. One evening, as the sun bled gold over the hills, Lydia found Caleb by the fence line. He was fixing a section of wire, his broad shoulders framed by the dying light. She walked toward him slowly, her steps uncertain. "Need a hand?" she asked. He looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "I could use one," he said with a small smile. She crouched beside him, holding the wire steady while he fastened it. They worked in silence for a while, the rhythm of their movements calm, familiar. When the last nail was hammered in, Lydia sat back and watched the horizon where the sun dipped behind the hills. "I never said thank you," she said quietly. Caleb glanced at her. "For what?" "For everything." Her voice trembled slightly. "For taking me in. For teaching me. For not seeing me the way everyone else did." He studied her for a long moment. The wind played with a loose strand of her hair, and his voice, when it came, was low and gentle. "You don't owe me thanks, Lydia. You did the hard part yourself." She shook her head. "No, you saw me when no one else bothered to look. You could have left me there." Caleb turned his gaze to the horizon. "You deserve more than pity," he said quietly. "More than what the world handed you?" The words hit her deeper than she expected. "You deserve more." They weren't soft or sentimental. They were solid, like something she could build a life on. She looked down at her hands, stronger now, calloused from work, and realized she no longer saw them as ugly. They were proof of her survival, her worth. She'd grown from the frightened girl who'd been traded like an animal into a woman who could stand beside a man like Caleb, not beneath him. The air between them grew still. The sky deepened to violet and the first stars appeared. Lydia drew a slow breath and whispered, almost to herself, "You saved me, Caleb." He turned to her, his eyes soft but steady. "No," he said. "You saved yourself. I just made sure you had a place to do it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the ranch, the lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill, filled the silence like a lullaby. Then Lydia smiled, a small, quiet smile that carried all the gratitude words couldn't hold. As she stood to go, Caleb reached out and gently touched her arm, the one scarred by the fire. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "Don't ever let anyone make you forget that." That night, as she lay in bed, the wind whispered through the open window, carrying the scent of rain and earth. Lydia closed her eyes, her heart finally still. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel broken. She felt whole. And she knew that whatever came next, she would face it not as the girl who'd been traded, but as the woman who had reclaimed her worth. Winter passed gently that year. The snow came and went without cruelty, leaving behind a softer, greener world. By the time spring arrived, the land around Holt Ranch had burst back into life, fields dotted with wildflowers, calves stumbling beside their mothers, and the river running full and bright again. Lydia loved spring. It felt like a second chance, an echo of her own rebirth. Each morning she woke to the smell of dew and hay and the faint aroma of coffee drifting from the kitchen. She'd long since earned her place among the ranch hands, and even they seemed to treat her as one of their own. She laughed easily now, worked harder than any of them, and carried herself with quiet pride. But underneath it all, something new had begun to stir. A warmth she didn't quite know how to name. It had everything to do with Caleb Holt. The giant cowboy was as steady as ever, his manner gentle but distant. He worked hard, spoke little, and carried a weight in his eyes that only Lydia seemed to see. Yet as the months passed, the space between them had changed. It wasn't just respect anymore. It was something unspoken, alive, waiting. One evening, after a long day of mending fences, Lydia was brushing down one of the horses when Caleb appeared in the doorway of the barn. He leaned against the post, watching her with a faint smile. "You work that mare like she owes you money," he teased softly. Lydia chuckled. "She keeps pretending she's tired when she's not." "She's testing you," he said, stepping closer. "Horses do that when they like someone." Lydia raised an eyebrow. "You saying she likes me?" Caleb smiled. a small, quiet smile that always seemed to undo her. "I'm saying she trusts you." Their eyes met for a heartbeat too long, and Lydia quickly turned back to the horse. But her pulse betrayed her calm. Something had changed between them, something real and fragile and frightening. That night, there was a barn dance in the nearby town. Caleb rarely went to social gatherings, but one of the ranch hands, a wiry man named Pike, insisted. "Everyone's going," he said. "Even Lydia should come. The girl works harder than all of us combined." Lydia hesitated, but Pike's teasing grin and Caleb's quiet nod convinced her. "Go," Caleb said simply. "You deserve a night that isn't about work." When she arrived at the barn dance, the world seemed brighter, lamps strung high, fiddles playing fast, and laughter spilling out like sunlight. She wore a simple blue dress one of the neighbor women had helped her sew. It wasn't fancy, but when she caught her reflection in the window pane, she barely recognized herself. She looked happy. Caleb arrived later, his hat low, his shirt freshly pressed. The crowd parted when he entered, not out of fear, but respect. When his eyes found hers across the dance floor, everything around her faded. He crossed the room slowly. "You clean up well," he said. "So do you," she replied softly. The music shifted, a slower tune, gentle and sweet. Caleb hesitated, then held out his hand. "Dance with me?" Her heart pounded, but she nodded. When his hand touched hers, it was warm and steady, grounding her even as her chest fluttered like a startled bird. They moved slowly under the hanging lanterns, the scent of hay and lilacs drifting in the night air. Lydia had never danced before, but Caleb's quiet guidance made it easy. His hand on her waist, the soft pressure of his palm against hers. It felt like a language all its own. For the first time, Lydia felt truly seen. Not as the girl who had been traded, not as the woman who had survived, but simply as herself. The laughter, the music, the glow, it all seemed to wrap around them like a promise. When the song ended, neither moved. Caleb looked down at her, his eyes searching. "You belong here, Lydia," he murmured. "Not just to this ranch, to this life." Her throat tightened. "And you?" He smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm learning to belong too." The night carried on, but for Lydia, the dance had already ended. In that single, quiet moment, she understood what her journey had been leading toward. Not rescue, not redemption, but love that grew out of respect and shared strength. And as the lanterns flickered above them, Lydia realized spring wasn't just in the air. It was in her heart. Summer came to Holt Ranch in waves of heat and gold. The fields shimmered under the sun, the cattle lazed by the river, and the rhythm of life fell into a peaceful, steady hum. But for Lydia, something within her had changed forever. The dance that night hadn't been just a moment, it had been a turning point. Since then, every look, every shared silence between her and Caleb had carried a new meaning, quiet but undeniable. She'd begun to see how their lives had woven together, strand by strand, through labor, trust, and unspoken care. Yet love, she knew, wasn't owed. It had to be earned, just like respect. And so Lydia kept working, kept learning, and kept proving, not to Caleb, but to herself, that she had value no one could trade or take. One morning, while fixing the corral fence, Lydia noticed a rider approaching from the road, a man from the neighboring town waving his hat in greeting. He carried a letter. When he handed it to her, Lydia's heart sank at the sight of the handwriting. It was her mother's. She took the letter to the porch and sat beneath the old oak. The paper trembled slightly in her hands as she read. "Lydia, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve to ask. But I heard what you said that day, how you said you're not mine anymore. You were right. You never were mine to trade. I did what I thought would keep us both alive, but I see now it was fear, not love, that guided me. If you can, remember me kindly. I have little left and no one to call family. I hope you've found peace. Maybe one day you'll visit. If not, know I'm proud of what you've become." Mara, the words blurred as tears filled Lydia's eyes. Her mother hadn't changed much, she could tell, but there was softness there that hadn't existed before. Perhaps the years had worn her pride down, just as life had softened Lydia's own anger. Caleb found her sitting quietly, the letter folded in her lap. "Bad news?" he asked gently. She shook her head. "No, just a goodbye that sounds a little like an apology." He sat beside her, the boards creaking beneath his weight. "You gonna write back?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "Maybe someday. Maybe forgiveness doesn't have to be written. It just has to be real." He nodded. "That's wisdom right there." The breeze stirred, carrying the smell of hay and the faint call of a hawk in the distance. Lydia looked out over the land, the fences, the barns, the vast stretch of sky, and realized how far she'd come from the frightened, unwanted girl she'd once been. Every scar, every memory, every loss had led her here, to a place, a life, and a man who saw her not as broken, but whole. Caleb turned to her after a long silence. "Lydia," he said quietly, "I've spent most of my life building fences, around this land and around myself. But I think maybe it's time I stopped doing that." Her heart stilled. He met her gaze, steady and open. "You don't owe me anything and I don't expect anything. But if you'll stay, by choice, not need, I'd be honored to have you beside me." Lydia's throat tightened. She didn't need to think. "I already chose to stay," she whispered. And in that simple truth, everything she'd ever wanted found its answer. They didn't kiss right away. They didn't need to. The look between them said more than words ever could, a promise built not from pity or rescue, but from understanding. That evening, the sun dipped low over Holt Ranch, painting the fields in molten gold. Lydia stood beside Caleb, watching the horizon blaze with light. Once her mother had traded her for a cow. That cruel bargain had stolen her childhood, but it had also sent her down the road that led here, to a life of dignity and quiet joy. For the first time in her life, Lydia didn't question her worth. She didn't measure it in others' eyes or in what she could give. She simply knew it, and as the last light faded, she whispered into the warm air, not to anyone but herself, "I was never the trade. I was the treasure."